Hey, Lakeview family. Hope all is well this week. Hope you're staying cool, man. It is hot, very hot, but we will survive. And before you know it, we'll be talking about snowfall and whether or not we should have church. So enjoy it while it lasts. Sunday, looking forward to being back in the pulpit on Sunday. We're back in town from our trip to Kansas City. It was fantastic. And we'll be tackling 2 Samuel chapter 7, the first part of 7, verses 1 through 14a. And this is a really great passage to kind of lay over this conversation we've been having about keeping up with Jesus, not the Joneses. And this begins to give us opportunities to see kind of what this looks like as it plays out in the life of David, who, as we know, was God's person who was selected to rule after the people who wanted a king chose Saul. Early on, God rejects Saul and begins to draw a picture of what it looks like when humans follow the path that humans follow and have followed since the garden. And gives us an image and an idea of what that looks like and the corruption that will continue to come and did continue to come with the people wanting to have a king. You have Israel divides. They come together under the reign of David, but then they divide again in the coming chapters, ultimately leading to their exile to Babylon, conquering by both Assyria and Babylon, and just a lot of pain, a lot of hardship, but not without the promise. And so those are all the things that we have to hold in tension. And this is the part where that I think in a lot of ways makes the Old Testament difficult at times because of this tension that we have to hold. And all along recognizing that there are things about God that we cannot grasp or fathom. It doesn't mean we don't try. It doesn't mean that we don't remain open for God to reveal more of God's self to us. We certainly do that. And the reality that we grow in understanding of who God is and how God functions in the world. And we're studying these passages. We're becoming students of Scripture, particularly the Old Testament, to learn about who God is. Right? We're not trying to prove God. We're not trying to define God and get him in a box so that we understand him and then can kind of put that on top of our situation. We are trying to grow in intimacy and relationship with the God of the universe and begin to recognize, how then do I live that out? How do I be a part of this covenant relationship with God that we see throughout Scripture? So we come to this passage, and it's an interesting dialogue, right, with David and the prophet Nathan, who shows up for the first time on the scene. We will see him again next week. Ooh, sorry, David. But Nathan's here. David asks, and actually doesn't ask, he declares that he is going to build God a house. He has his house made of cedar, brags about it. I'm sure it was pretty fancy and awesome. He was, after all, the king. And maybe there's some of this kind of do be like other people things that are creeping in to David's life. And I think we can see that in even the desire to have a temple. Now, it's framed, obviously, from David's perspective. As we read it in the text, we can read into this of a genuine desire for creating a place of permanence for God, now that the people of Israel, by God's hand, have a sense of peace and have a place. So we could see the argument for David, right, that because of that, it makes sense that then God, like, who am I as a king to have this great house? And the God who helped me have all these things and protected us as a people and gave us a place in a city, this God does not have a place in which to dwell. And initially, we see Nathan say, yeah, go do whatever you have in mind to do. God, the Lord, will be with you. Which that should ring a bell. That has been a part of this, of the reality of God's presence with David for sure, but the people of Israel, because of the promise, and that promise of being with them, being present. And to this point, God's presence has been mobile. He's been in the tent, right? As they've traveled, as they've gone out, the text talks about, as they've gone out and come back in, God has gone out and come back in with them. So there's this real sense, and God in his response and his rebuttal and his vision to Nathan of saying, no, I do not want a house built. I will build David a house, and I'll hold on to that house. There's some interesting things in the language. But God says no. And we're not quite clear. The text doesn't really give us all of the reasons why. If you compare this with Chronicles and kind of the parallel text, and even some reference in Kings, there's talk about David was too busy with his wars, or even the fact that he won so many battles and essentially slayed and caused so much blood that he then was maybe in some ways disqualified for building the temple. So there certainly is something to be looked at in that regard. But ultimately, God also responds in saying, dude, I've been mobile forever. I've been, and he's like, there was nobody in the leaders and the judges that I asked to build me a temple. That's not where I dwell. I can't be contained. And so we have this, this tension, but it talks about, and this is where that word house comes back in. That word in this chapter alone is used, I think it's 19 times, many times. And it means three different things. So it means David's actual house, his palace made of cedar. It has the temple, so God's house is, and when David references building God a house, same word. And then God, when he says he built David a house, what God is talking about there is the dynasty of David. So the dynastic kingdom and reign of David, which, if we're paying attention to scripture and the story, that begins this thread in covenant language with God and Israel to the person of Jesus, because it is through the line of David that Jesus comes to be, and it comes as king, right? So some important theological ramifications come down in this text. This is a very significant passage in a lot of ways, and in part it is because of this establishment of this house of David, this dynasty of David that will never end. And though I'm in the exile, and I think it's in the time of Hezekiah, like actually there is no longer on the throne a descendant of David, like physically, so that ends, but that promise still continues, and out of the line of David comes the person of Jesus. So I have this pretty significant things here, and there's a couple things that I want to press into, and I'm just going to do one now that I'll unpack a little bit more. But there's really in the text, what we see with David is this idea of forbearance, of waiting. We pick this up. This text is often used in the season of Advent because it is a waiting. It is God saying to David and to the people that no, not now. It is not for you. It is not at this time to have a temple. It will come in your son Solomon. And so even that, why Solomon gets to do it and David doesn't. I mean, again, some would argue David was at war, Solomon was at peace. So there's some things there, but it's this sense of waiting. And one commentator said this: the prophet Nathan invites us together with David to balance our aspirations and our limits in light of God's great promises and God's plan for a long story arc. And man, I thought that was so powerful, and I'm definitely going to click on that. But this idea of our aspirations and our limits, things that we want to do in the name of God, and in some where people, our accountability partners, your pastor, others in our lives would initially say, yes, that is good. Do what is in your heart to do. But actually, did we check with God? Did we bring that before? Did Nathan bring that before God deliberately? But what we see is this kind of long scope arc. And in this text, in this passage, we get these 6 kind of things and divine action. So there's 3 specific divine action of David's past and 3 specific divine action for David's future. So in his past, I took you from the pasture, right? And I have been with you, he says. And then God says, I have cut off all the armies. So these ways that God has been with David in the past. And the divine action for David's and Israel's future, God says this: I will make you a great name. I will appoint a place for my people Israel. I will give you rest for your enemies. And what we can't forget is this text, and some scholars would argue and say that there were several editions of this text, some that came out in the time of the exile. So these words are being spoken about David, but to the people of Israel who were in exile, and this coming as a promise and a hope for their future. So it isn't just about David, but it's about the line of David because and for the people of Israel, for God's people. So it isn't really about David, like all of this. It's about God and these things that we learn to be true about God. And ultimately, that as followers of God and seeking to be like Jesus, we're seeking for the aspirations of the kingdom and the king, and putting aside and pausing and waiting for our own aspirations and checking our egos at the door. Because when you think about a temple and this idea of being like everyone else for David, there could be a whole lot of hubris wrapped up in this desire to want to build a temple, because for a king in their city, that was, you had your own palace and you had a place for idol worship and for your gods. And that was a measure of your success and your posture amongst the other leaders. So those are all the things that are kind of happening and going on. And this text is inherently political, and there may be some things that we talk about and what we can learn about that, because we're talking about God establishing a human kingdom and what that means, and then holding in tension, right? God's kingdom, rule and reign, which is markedly different than the reign of kingdoms of this world, which holds true for us as today as well. So have a great rest of your week. Stay cool, my friends, and we'll see you Sunday. Blessings.